I moved to California in 1995 and almost immediately was drawn into then the discussion over the impact of the California Board of Regents, what was known as SP1, which effectively banned what had been the affirmative action programs in the UCs based on race. The analysis that we did then, what I want to do today is to actually reflect on that analysis and then reassess it in light of today's, sort of from today's vantage point. And then I'll finish with just a few of what I think are some implications that emerge out of this. So in 1996, the analysis I did, and I did it in conjunction with Rhonda Sharp at Duke University, we first of all looked at a lot of data about the characteristics of the students who were getting into the UCs, and we predicted a redistribution of Black and Latino students from the highly selective UC campuses to the less selective UC campuses. We also tried to take an approach of thinking about a kind of cost-benefit analysis of the value of slots at the different campuses across different groups. And we suggested that the relative private benefit cost of the selective campuses was slightly higher for Black and Latino students than for white students. And we made this argument largely based on both some evidence on retention, but also on an argument about participation and the value of social networks for groups who were historically marginalized or disenfranchised from the system. So the argument was that indeed the loss of the affirmative action programs would not cost people getting college degrees, it would just affect where they might go to school. And so you're really looking at shifting between the two campuses, who gets the most out of being really at the two we were talking about were UC Berkeley and UCLA. And then finally we tried to examine, although admittedly with not the same kind of focus as more recent cases have done, what the educational benefits were of diversity on the different campuses. And at the time when we did our analysis in 1996, we pronounced the evidence on educational benefits as limited, and in fact drew quite heavily more on looking at graduate and professional schools, and also looked at some of the work in the private sector on police departments. So looking back on that analysis from the perspective of 2013, first thing is, and this is something rare that economists get to do, you get to look back and say, I was right about something. So indeed, our first prediction of a redistribution of the Black and Latino students from the most highly selective campuses to the others has been borne out in the data since then. And I'll note that it may have been just not only the result of SP1, but as some people have noted, and I know in some of Glenn's work he's noted this, the idea of the percentage plans tends to exacerbate that particular outcome. But the second issue, that of looking at the private cost and benefit, as I said earlier, we focused quite a bit on retention and on an assertion about the value of social networks. And perhaps in part from my perspective now of having been an academic administrator, I've realized that that needs to be reevaluated to look particularly at the experience of students within those selected institutions a bit more. At my own college, at Pomona College, I spent a great deal of time as a dean I sent out data to departments about the distribution of students across majors and asked departments to take a hard look at that distribution and asked each one of them to come back and tell me were they happy with their distribution. This is what deans do. You don't want to say you should not be happy, so you send out this thing and hope that they lead to the right way. And in some recent work looking at the distribution of people by majors in the UC system by R.C. Diacano and Hotz at Duke has also kind of raised this question about what happens once people get to the institution. They talk about it in terms of academic mismatch, but this is a phrase that I kind of recoil at slightly because it tends to imply is that you don't belong here, when in fact what I think is most interesting about their work is the evidence that certain UC campuses simply aren't doing a very good job. And that the problem, and here I'm again basing on my own experience as an academic administrator, may be less what the student is bringing than how the campuses teach. And that is actually a bigger issue than just the issue for Black and Latino students when we look at, and particularly the STEM fields, at the shortage generally in the US of producing people in these fields. But it does raise that question of where are you going to get the highest value added for campuses, and I think necessitates a rethinking of my initial calculus. The fourth reassessment is that since we did that analysis, there is a much larger evidence base on the educational benefits of diversity, at least within the traditional university. And this evidence base has emerged in part because of some of the legal cases, most notably the Michigan case. And I think that's a good thing, but it also reflects, and I was just having a conversation about this, a shift away from thinking about this issue as one of redistributive justice and more towards one of a business case and kind of making that sort of argument. And then the fifth kind of piece of reassessment that I would offer is that when I go back and look at that analysis and the sort of things we looked at, I realize that much needs to be reevaluated in the context of the changing landscape for higher education. And that changing landscape has multiple features. First of all, the increased hierarchy within higher education. The most selective schools over the past 10, 12 years have become even more selective. The less selective schools have become less selective. And so the impact of going to a very selective school versus a less selective may be accentuated in that kind of context. We also have the increased competition for spots in an era of defunding of higher education. So our argument largely sort of assumed, and it believed that California was going to remain committed to its master plan, where for the top 12% of high school graduates, there's supposed to be a spot in the UCs. And so we mainly focused on moving people among those UC campuses. Whereas now that commitment has been stepped back from. What we may actually be talking about, and what some recent evidence from the Public Policy Institute of California supports, is that some people are not going to get to a UC even if they've met the UC criteria. They might end up at one of the Cal States. Some of the people who've met the Cal State criteria will get kicked out of the Cal States. They may end up at one of the community colleges, and the students who might have gone to the community colleges end up with no place at all to go. So that era of defunding and of reduction in the number of spots is something that also has changed since then. We have the growth in the for-profit sector and what that implies for thinking about higher education diversity. We have increased attention overall to the issues of access, and here I think about the recent work of Hoxby and Avery and Hoxby and Turner over the number of students who meet the qualifications for selective schools but never actually apply to those schools or learn about them. And we have the growth in online learning, which turns our whole notions about the benefits of educational diversity in a completely different direction. All of those analyses are largely based on the traditional in-person classroom. What does it mean in the context of this higher education landscape? So in thinking this through, I have put together a table. And I'm going to show you this, and I'll warn you, I really like graphics, but this is probably a kooky table. Got lots of colors. But what I've tried to do is to think, it's sort of putting on two hats. The first hat is that I've been thinking a lot about this issue of online learning, partly in my role as an academic administrator, and what this means for what a college and university does. And I think about a college and university as delivering essentially a bundle of attributes. And those bundle of attributes, the first is the course content, that they're delivering some content, and we can think of the content both as traditional knowledge-based, but also some skill development. But higher education has also traditionally brought together you with a group of other peers. And so it's not just the content, it's also a group of peers that they've assembled around you. There's sort of like a Match.com kind of approach. Some institutions, and it varies in terms of the amount of this, also present as part of the bundle amenities. Things like, what kind of dormitory you live in or what sort of gym facilities, but also perhaps more importantly, the kind of one-on-one academic support, counseling, and so forth. Then there is this signaling aspect of this package, the kind of reputation that the college has and what that means for you in the market going forward, in the labor market. And then the other part of the package that I've highlighted is the social network that you join, which consists of not only the individuals you encounter while you're at the institution, but the network that you join after you've left that institution, the alumni, the entire historical network. So I think of those as kind of the 5 major pieces of this bundle overall. And then on the left-hand side, I've characterized institutions. I have grouped them as highly selective private colleges or universities, highly selective public, and here the definition is a little different than highly selective private in that I've included flagships whether they actually meet the kind of same criteria as the privates or not, other privates, other publics, and then I have put online privates, online hybrids, which are almost exclusively for profit at this moment, but as we know, many of the public institutions are about to move into that in a big way. And then I'll just mention Minerva because it's an interesting example at the end of this. And what I've tried to do is to think about how these institutions differ from each other and how this plays out in terms of thinking about the impact on the educational benefits of diversity, but also on the cost-benefit analysis for the individuals. And so let me start with the peer effects column, which one of the arguments for going to a more selective institution is that you're with peers who are really good and that has a beneficial educational spillover for you as the individual. And so that's one of the elements of the argument that there might be a stronger payoff for the underrepresented groups or the groups who are the outsiders. However, we've also seen argued, and I've certainly seen itself play it out, that the peer effects can have an effect on the delivery of the educational product, the pedagogy. So that if you're in a classroom full of people who have already had college level courses while they were in high school, it changes the pace of the class and it allows the professor, quite honestly, to be a little lazy in how they teach it. So that can also have an effect. On the amenities side, there's the very positive amenities, and I always have this one memory of a student that I met who had come to Scripps College from Roxbury, and I asked her how she found Scripps College and why she decided to come here. And she described being initially resistant to it, but when she visited campus, she said she was sitting on Sunday morning at the Sunday brunch, eating her chocolate-covered strawberry, sitting next to the swimming pool, and she said, I suddenly realized I deserved this. So there's that aspect to the amenity that I would argue that this young woman who had gone to an under-resourced high school in a neighborhood that was not as safe as others probably did deserve this more. But there's also a negative consequence to the amenities in that in research that's been done, particularly qualitative research done at a group of private liberal arts colleges on the East Coast, when minority students talk about encounters that have made them uncomfortable or when talk about encounters with racism, they have almost always happened outside the classroom, in the dormitories, in the residential life, in the parties, and so forth. And then I have the reputation and social network, which I would argue probably have become even more important as sources of benefits for being at a selective school relative to these others. The other thing I'll point out here is that when you look at this graphic, what you see if you're asking the question of where online learning and other types of frameworks are likely to have their biggest inroads, they're likely to if you look at just following the overlap of attributes, it's with the other private, the other public, using the California, the Cal State kind of examples, where what the online offers is very competitive with what those campuses offer to students, particularly if you're looking at very, very large classes where there's very little one-on-one interaction. The Minerva example, I'll just note, some of you may have heard of it, it's a project that hasn't actually launched, It's the idea of having an online for-profit but elite institution that would have highly selective admissions. It would draw an international student body. It would have a year of residential experience, and then people would be online for the last portion of that. And the notion behind it is it's going to bring in the peer effects, and indeed there's some notion that it will also bring in a reputation because they're trying to draw from Harvard and Stanford and these other kind of places. Remains to be seen as to whether they can really compete with that selective kind of experience. So looking at this changing landscape, I think is going to be important for thinking about this calculus. And I want to note that there's real differences in where people are in this changing landscape and how that's played out. So I've done, I'll call this a preliminary because I'm still looking at how I'm defining these numbers. But this looks at first-time, full-time undergraduates by race. These are only four-year institutions. I will note that I didn't include community colleges here, but remind you of the comment that Sam Myers made earlier about the importance of that sector. And what stands out here, if you study the analysis, is that right now, this is fall 2011, 8% of the first-time, full-time undergraduate black students were enrolled at online or for-profit institutions. And that compares with 7% in the highly selective sector. That is a number that has gone up over time and could potentially continue to grow, given the kinds of information issues that are outlined in some of the work on access, given the absence of information in most public high schools and so forth. So that's one particular concern that I'll highlight. And then you'll see in the other thing that shows is that the percentages of blacks and Hispanics who are in the other public and the other private is much higher than the other two groups. And I'm just giving you a bigger one here. And that points to, again, as I said, the most vulnerable to what is changing in this higher education landscape. So I made those points, and I want to conclude with just 4 kinds of issues that I think they raise as we think about public policy. The first is that if we look at some of the evidence about student success and persistence, and particularly it's focused on the STEM fields, which for our purposes include many of the social sciences that we rely on, they could say one of two things. They either say that there is a mismatch problem and students are at institutions where they can't compete, but they also, because they do very well at other institutions and end up persisting in these fields, and in fact because across racial and ethnic groups, these other institutions, the UC Riversides of the world, have greater success in creating this persistence. For me, it raises some serious questions about how we allocate resources across institutions. You know, at the K through 12, there's been a big push towards thinking about value added. But if you ask that question at the UCs, I would have to ask whether we should be redistributing. The last 3 things, and I'm out of time, so I'll just quickly do it. Part of that then says to me is that maybe we need to incentivize doing a better job with these groups. And that may involve both redistributing resources, but also figuring ways to incentivize rich private institutions like the one I just left to implement policies that help to enrich the diverse student bodies. We need to think about access issues, and I hope this is something we'll talk some more about, what the implications are of these online opportunities for access overall. Thank you.